Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
My first guest is an author who teaches philosophy at the University of San Francisco. She's also a human rights activist, campaigning for LGBT rights, the rights of the poor in her own country and the rights of the poor around the world right now. She's been all over the world over the years, apartheid South Africa, Central America, brilliant stuff. Right now, though, she's campaigning through her writing for the prosecution of US officials who authorised torture, murder and extraordinary rendition in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. Her latest book is called American Nuremberg, The Officials Who Should Stand Trial for Post-9/11 War Crimes. And it's the follow-up to her very successful book, Mainstreaming Torture, Ethical Approaches in Post-9/11 United States. We will tweet out links to where you can find the books. Let's welcome to the programme Rebecca Gordon. Rebecca, thanks for taking the call. How are you?
I'm doing very well. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening.
The pleasure is all ours. You're in the wonderful San Francisco, one of the places I would dearly, dearly love to visit, more than anything.
You had better come quick because it is getting so expensive that no one can afford to live here.
I hear you. But then again, so is the country I'm living in right now. So that makes two of us. Listen, congratulations on the books. And first of all, thanks for sending me the book. I don't always get the chance to read some or all of books when I have people on the programme. Your book is brilliant, Rebecca. You're asking some very serious questions in the book. What are we now? 14 years this year. Is it 14 years since September the 11th? Before we start talking about what happened post September the 11th, what do you remember of it yourself as an activist, as a human rights activist, as a teacher? What do you remember yourself of the time around and just after 9/11 and the mood in the country?
It's something I will never forget. And one of the things that's strangest to me is that I am now teaching students who were 4 and 5 years old on that day, whose memory is, of course, very different from mine. But I was teaching at that time. I was teaching a class at the Graduate Theological Union that was called The Communist Manifesto for Seminarians. And it was the second day of class, I think. And of course, we couldn't even begin to talk about anything but the attacks. I woke up with the alarm clock, with the radio at 6 a.m, and the first plane had just hit. My partner said to me something that she never said, which is, "This is something we need the television for." So we went and we looked, we turned on the television, and we actually saw the second plane hit the tower at 10 minutes later than the first one. And we said to each other, this was an attack that was designed to be seen on television, that was designed for its propaganda effects. And my father lives in New York, so of course one of my concerns was that he would be all right. I have a dear friend who lost her son in the attacks and who became part of this wonderful organization called 9/11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, who immediately saw that what the response was going to be not treating this as what it was, a terrible crime, but treating it as the beginning of a never-ending war, and they wanted to stop that. What happened almost immediately afterwards, though, was bizarre, because we were told on the one hand that the government would protect us and that life would go back to normal one day, but we saw American flags everywhere. And as you know, I suspect that you would, if you came to the United States today, see a lot more American flags just generally than you probably see the Union Jack where you are.
Right.
But what began to happen is that the businesses all over the country and in my hometown started to have these posters in their front windows, which had the American flag turned on its side with shopping bag handles coming out of it, and the slogan that read, "America, open for business." So essentially, our first response was, what we need to do to get this country back to normal is to remember that the business is the heart of America, and in fact, it was a week later when Wall Street and the stock exchange reopened. The symbolic moment was when a New York a New York firefighter actually was given the hammer to strike the bell to reopen the stock exchange, and that was the sign that the United States of America was back. At the same time...
Go on, go ahead. Yeah, go on. This is fascinating. Go ahead.
Well, the other thing that we saw is almost immediately revenge attacks on individuals around the country who were identified, usually falsely, as being Arab or being somehow terrorists themselves because of their coloring, because of their way of dress. A number of Sikhs, who are a religious group from India, who are not Muslim, who have nothing to do with Islam, but who wear turbans, were identified because the photographs we had seen of Osama bin Laden showed him in a turban, were identified by people on the street as responsible for September 11th and were physically attacked and beaten. Here in California, a number of Latinos, people from Mexico or Central America, who also often have dark skin, were misidentified as Arab and attacked as being responsible in some way for the attacks that happened in September 11th. So we immediately saw this response of xenophobia, of racism, and of terror.
Stoked up, Rebecca, undoubtedly by the likes of Fox News and others, because I remember covering the Mark Stroman murder. Stroman murdered two men, one who was originally from Pakistan, and he brutally injured a terrific man called Rais Bhuiyan, who actually campaigned to save Stroman from the death penalty. And I remember reading that case and having very little sympathy for Stroman while I was reading about it initially. But then when looking back at some of the news talk shows, the flagship shows on Fox and elsewhere, they were really stirring it up, those programs at the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they are stirring it up to this day. That's the really frightening thing. So to this day, we see people like Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, who are running for the Republican nomination to run for president of this country, basically campaigning on promises that they will commit as many war crimes as Bush and Cheney did, that they will be just as tough on global terrorism as Bush and Cheney promised the American people they would be. So sadly, that has not changed.
Rebecca, it's I want to mention the book. We've just tweeted out the book. Folks, I want you to get your hands on a copy of American Nuremberg, the US officials who should stand trial for post-9/11 war crimes. The author of the book, Rebecca Gordon, is on the line. Now, let's talk about what happened after 9/11, Rebecca. Let's talk about the immediate reaction. Straight away, there were several things very wrong. I was working in commercial radio in Ireland at the time, and to my shame, wasn't talking about this, and I didn't begin to talk about it for 2 or 3 years afterwards. But the United States' immediate response to it, which was to ignore the fact that 17 of these hijackers were allegedly from Saudi Arabia. That's very important, by the way, because NBC News are running a big story today about Obama visiting Saudi Arabia tomorrow, while they're still talking about these 28 pages of the 9/11 report, which haven't been released to the public. And what did Saudi Arabia do? Did Saudi Arabia facilitate the attacks and all of that? But what it did was, of course, we went to Afghanistan and we went to Iraq. And of course, Iraq had nothing to do with September the 11th. And it was in Iraq and Afghanistan that we began to see, as you've written about so brilliantly in your books, some of the completely heinous crimes committed by not just by the United States but by British troops as well, including grabbing people whom were finger pointed by the Northern Alliance as being part of Al Qaeda and subjecting these people to extraordinary rendition. Talk to us about that. From the get-go, there were very, very, very sinister things going on.
That's exactly right, from the very beginning. And actually, the first one happened, and most people don't know this, here in the United States. Almost immediately, the FBI rounded up about 600 Muslims who were living in the U.S., either with tourist visas, student visas, some with green cards, and took them to a jail in Brooklyn, New York, which is part of New York City, where they were literally within a stone's throw of the Statue of Liberty. And these men were held incommunicado. They had no contact with their families, with their lawyers, for 6 months, One of them, at least we know, was raped with a police torch. One of them, many of them were exposed to extremes of heat and cold. They were left in the February cold to stand outside in hospital gowns and bare feet. They were beaten repeatedly with electric cords and other objects. And eventually they were released because not one of them had anything to do with September 11th or any kind of terrorism. But this was our first reaction. Then, as you say, the United States went to war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And it's interesting that you mention who it was who were the 17 out of the 19 hijackers, because who those hijackers were is almost like a litmus test in this country for who is the U.S. enemy of the day. So I asked my students back in about 2005, 2006, who were the attackers on September 11th? And they all told me they were Iraqis. A few years later, when we were kind of winding down, not that we've really done that, the war in Iraq, and beginning to gin up some kind of war against Iran, they were all convinced that those 19 people must have been Iranians. And of course, as you say, the reality is that 17 out of 19 of them were actually Saudi nationals.
Well, do you know what, Rebecca? You, as a journalist and as an activist, will know the old adage that a lie travels twice around the world before the truth has time to put its trousers on. But that's extraordinary that so many intelligent young men and women, bright young men and women, still think that Iraq had something to do with 9/11. It's extraordinary.
And that is not an accident, because that's exactly what Dick Cheney set out to demonstrate almost immediately. And we now know that as early as March of 2002, so we're talking now well before the attacks of September 11th, he was meeting with the heads of all of the biggest oil companies in the United States in order to put together what at that time they were calling was the energy strategy for the United States. People repeatedly asked for transcripts of those meetings, even a list of the people who had been present in those meetings. And over and over again, Cheney and his office stonewalled what it eventually turned out that they were discussing with the heads of the biggest oil companies was the oil fields in Iraq and what it would take to regain direct U.S. access to those oil fields, and what they all agreed was Saddam Hussein had to go.
Rebecca, we're just getting a little bit of sound interference there. I don't know if there's a bit of cable rattle going on there. Yeah.
Okay, I'll be a little more careful. How's this?
Yeah, that's great, thanks. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Okay. This is fascinating, folks. Rebecca Gordon is on as a line to us now from San Francisco. Check out her book. It's American Nuremberg, the US officials who should stand trial for post-9/11 war crimes. It's terrific. Rebecca, we're getting lots of tweets on this, unsurprisingly. People can tweet at Richie Allen Show. Number of people asking me. The State of Israel has got a lot of questions to answer about its treatment of the Palestinians, obviously, and its own human rights record. I think regardless of whether you believe in the State of Israel or not, I think most people who are fair and honest would agree with that. Saudi Arabia is an absolute tyranny. Let's not even try and pretend it isn't. It's one of the worst places on earth. It's got to be. In fact, I do mention sometimes on the programme, a friend of mine had the misfortune while working there some years ago to come across a public beheading by accident. He was out walking in Riyadh, and came across it. When you've been investigating 9/11, Rebecca, was there any evidence at all that you came across that either Jewish officials or Saudi officials had any kind of knowledge that something was going down and avoided New York or avoided the World Trade Center district? Did you ever come across anything like that?
I've seen a lot of references to those ideas. I cannot honestly say that I think there's any truth to it. I don't really know. I've not seen anything that looks like hard evidence. I think what we have plenty of hard evidence of is the illegal occupation of what are called the occupied territories, Gaza and the West Bank. And even without having to dig deep into those theories, we can easily say that the Israeli government is creating its own apartheid state in Israel, and that there's, without getting into questions of 9/11, we can, which I really is not, it's not something that I personally believe.
Fair enough,
But,
Rebecca. Fair enough. I've got to mention as well, by the way, folks, we've got FBI records on the record, FBI agents on the record, who said that they were disgusted that the extended family of Osama bin Laden were allowed to fly out of America the day after 9/11, when every flight in the country was still grounded. And FBI agents have gone on the record saying, well, they told us this guy orchestrated the whole thing. Why, his family were people of interest. We would have liked him to have spoken to him. That's another anomaly that has never really been satisfied. So it hasn't. And victims, the victims' families, it's something that really irks them to this day that the bin Ladens were allowed to fly out of the country.
Absolutely. And Michael Moore documented that very clearly in his film, Fahrenheit 9/11. That seems to be a very well-established truth. And as you mentioned earlier, it would be nice to have those extra 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report. But to get back to Iraq, because I think this is one of the points I make in the book, that in some ways, and we don't often think of it this way, the central crime that led to many of the other crimes, including the torture and the rendition, was the deep desire of the Bush White House, really led by Dick Cheney, to go into Iraq as part of a long-term plan to destabilize the entire Middle East and remake it in a form that the United States thought would be more beneficial to some of its interests.
Now, Rebecca, this is brilliant. Sorry for interrupting you. This is brilliant. Yeah. So do you have sympathy with General Wesley Clark then? Do you believe him when he says he was at the Pentagon and he spoke to high-ranking officials there who said there was a plan over the next decade, and the plan included incursions in Libya, in Syria and elsewhere? Do you believe him based on what we've seen?
Oh, absolutely, because the plan is plainly available for anyone who wants to find it. It was published by the Project for a New American Century and presented to then President Bill Clinton in the 1990s. The original version of the plan was actually called A Clean Break, and it was prepared for Benjamin Netanyahu when he first took over as prime minister in Israel. And what it proposed is exactly what later came out in the Project for a New American Century's proposal. And the people behind this are people who then came with Dick Cheney into the White House. And so yes, and what the plan proposed was exactly this, that the United States should begin with Iraq, then Libya and Syria, in an effort to destabilize, as you say. And this is why I say the crime of attacking Iraq, which was an unprovoked, illegal war. And Kofi Annan, who was Secretary General of the UN, has said so. Other people have said so. It violated all the international laws of war. That unprovoked attack on Iraq is in some ways the worst of the crimes, because that is what has led to the most horrific human suffering, up to and including the refugee crisis that we now see on the very edge of Europe, in which over half of the people of Syria have had to leave their homes, and somewhere between 4 and 5 million of them have had to leave the country. And we are now seeing the worst refugee crisis that Europe has seen since the end of World War II.
And certainly in our lifetime. Can we talk about Abu Ghraib, by the way?
Yes, absolutely.
Because you've written so much about Abu Ghraib in both your books. And I remember covering that and seeing those photographs when they were released. And obviously, when you see them, they're very sad. I'm not going to lie and say I was terribly angry. I was more depressed when I saw the pictures, and I looked at Lindy England, and I saw Lindy England, and what I saw in Lindy England was I saw a young girl from a poor background.
That's exactly right.
Right? I saw a girl with maybe not a lot of education. That doesn't mean that she's not intelligent, but a pretty simple girl who was brutalised in basic training in Carolina or wherever the hell she was when she was trained, and she was sent to this place, this horrible prison, and they were told to do these unspeakable things. She was hung out to dry. Of course, she had to be punished in some way because she has a conscience and she should have known what she was doing was wrong. But Rebecca, we've never, ever, ever dug down into who told, authorised, or even encouraged those guards at Abu Ghraib to do those things to those Iraqis.
That's exactly right. Although we do have a pretty good idea who told them in general that they should create the conditions, in quotes, for further interrogation. And that was members of the CIA and their contractors who were working for a company called CACI in Iraq, who were doing the actual upstairs interrogations, while downstairs, these guys, these people, and they were not even regular army. They were army reservists who had been brought in to run the prison camp at Abu Ghraib because the army itself actually didn't have very many people who knew how to do it. So what these people were people who in civilian life were working in rural America in U.S. prisons. And part of what they brought, unfortunately, is exactly the same kind of attitude towards people of color, towards people who are incarcerated, as less than human and as deserving of whatever kind of treatment you choose to give them. They brought that culture of U.S. prisons into the prison in Baghdad. They also very much looked up to these members of the CIA, these contractors. They thought they were the most brilliant warriors and they wanted to be like them. Now, the individual who was sent to Abu Ghraib in order to get more information out of the prisoners there. And at that point, the problem they had was that the U.S. had gone into Iraq on the pretext that Saddam Hussein was harboring weapons of mass destruction. And somehow, without all the bombs and all the troops and all the investigations and all the torture, they had failed to locate these weapons of mass destruction. So General Jeffrey Miller had been running the prison at Guantanamo. And that's where Donald Rumsfeld first sent a list of 10 different techniques that he wanted to see used in order to get them to get information from their prisoners saying there was a link between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. Jeffrey Miller was then deployed to run all of the prisons in Iraq, and especially Abu Ghraib, which was the biggest prison the U.S. was running at the time, with the direct charge to, quote, Gitmoize, that is, transfer from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib the techniques and the methods that were being used in Guantanamo.
It's extraordinary, Rebecca. I mean,
and of course, he has never been held accountable.
Never been held
was
accountable.
His boss, Donald Rumsfeld, who was the head of the Pentagon.
These guys, Rebecca, these guys have practically bragged about it in their memoirs. We know Cheney has bragged about it on television, even as recently as a few months ago on Fox News. He was, he was bullish about what he did, said he'd do it again. I suppose he feels in some way immune because the United States isn't signed up to the International Criminal Court. Not that it really matters. I mean, I'd love to get your opinion on the International Criminal Court. I'm somebody who believes that it only goes after, leaders from pretty small countries where things have happened, bad things have happened, and they need to be addressed, but they ignore things that happen in other more wealthier, more, I suppose, countries that play a bigger part on the world stage, for want of a better way of putting it. I mean, we've got, we've got arguably the greatest war criminal alive in this country, Anthony Blair. But there's never been any mention, despite repeated calls from some of the most respected and some of the most consistent human rights campaigners, for this guy to be arrested, brought to The Hague to answer questions about the lies he told. So I have no faith in the ICC anyway. Cheney, Bush, Rumsfeld basically bragged about doing it. This is the horrible reality of it. Where do we go with this, Rebecca? What do we do? I mean, you're doing an amazing thing by writing these books and, clinically and surgically analysing what these guys did and how they did it. Are we ever going to get these guys?
Well, I think we will. We will probably not get them the way I would like to see, which is for my government to appoint a special prosecutor and to look at all of the violations of treaties that the U.S. has signed, which under our Constitution, by the way, become the supreme law of the land. So when we sign the UN Convention Against Torture, that makes that convention part of our federal law system. A lot of people don't realize that, but it's right there in the 6th article of our Constitution. So I would love, and there are other federal laws, many other federal laws that have been broken. And I would, of course, love to see those prosecutions happen. Sadly, President Obama really drew a line under that in the very beginning of his first term, when the day after he signed the executive orders prohibiting shutting down the CIA black sites, he said, however, we need to look forward and not backwards. And the problem with impunity is then people think it's perfectly fine to just go on and do it again. The reason I say I'm hopeful, though, is that I have very dear friends who work in the world of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, which is the law of war, who will be patient and gradually over decades, they are just now bringing to trial people like the intellectual authors of the murder of Monsignor Romero in El Salvador and the 1989 murders of the 6 Jesuits and their housekeeper and her daughter, again by people the U.S. was supporting and trained in El Salvador. And we are gradually seeing these people being brought to trial in individual countries. The law of war is this thing that's called jus cogens, which literally means a law that compels. And what it compels is any country that actually has the war criminals on their territory is legally compelled to hold them until they can be handed over to a proper tribunal.
Can I just jump in, because we're getting loads and loads of tweets and comments on this.
Oh, let's hear.
I've had an email from Karen Lomax, and Karen says, I'm really enjoying listening to Rebecca, and I'm really thrilled to hear the optimism in her voice. But Richie, she says, going back to the Vietnam War, the My Lai massacre, over 500 Vietnamese were murdered by US soldiers in Vietnam, and nobody was ever held accountable for that. Why should we hold out any hope now that the men responsible for the extraordinary rendition, torture and murder of Iraqis and others will ever be held to account? That's Karen Lomax. She's right, and when I was, flicking through the book today, because I'm going to give the book a proper read this week. It's my read this week, Rebecca. It's
that
brilliant.
Makes me happy.
No, it's brilliant. It's terrific that you wrote it. But it's wonderful the way you juxtapose, even in the title, about how the United States was so involved in the Nuremberg tribunals. But since then, and this isn't Kick the United States Day, because my own, the country I'm living in, Britain, has its own horrific past. You've spent a lot of time in Central America, so you know about, CIA sponsored, phony revolutions and murders in Central America and what that's all caused. It just goes on, Rebecca. That's what Karen Lomax is getting at. It just goes on year in, year out. And we kind of take it. People like you are courageous, and you put your careers on the line, and you go out there and you speak about these things, and you get yourself into trouble. I mean, you're tailor-made for Fox News to go after you, somebody like you, And yet, what happens? I understand the frustration from Karen there. Look back to the My Lai massacre. Right. Nobody was ever, 40 years ago, nobody will ever be held accountable.
Well, except for poor Lieutenant Calley, who was the lieutenant who was actually in charge of the company that
Bill Calley, that's right. Yeah.
He's the only one. But yeah, nobody above him ever was. I will say, there were hearings, there were investigations, and in some ways, and here's where Jean-Paul Sartre and Bertrand Russell come in Europe. They held a people's tribunal, which obviously didn't have any enforcement power. In some ways, I guess, in the case of Vietnam, what we have is the verdict of history. And the verdict of history is that the United States did terrible and criminal things in that country. I agree that, none of the people at the height of the highest reaches in the United States, or even for that matter in France before, were ever held accountable for those horrors. But here's what I think. And this is actually one of the little epigrams in the book. The arc of history is very long, but it bends towards justice. And this is what I have to believe, that For example, and by the way, I'm not really as brave as you think I am. My career is not on the line for what I did. My university actually is proud of me, and I'm just a part-time teacher there anyway. So don't talk.
Well, it's good to hear that, but we know what I'm not trying to be melodramatic. We know what they've done to other academics like you who've come out and spoken against the system. Yeah.
Absolutely. And my partner and I were on the FBI no-fly list for a few years, which was very interesting.
Why?
Well, we don't know because they would never tell us. But we think it was because we were part of the small group of people who were publishing a newspaper that was called Wartime's Tiempo de Guerras, that was attempting to say that there could be another response to September 11th besides a military response, was trying, even in those days, to uncover the reality of what the country was doing.
That's the definition of fascism. We've got probably about, it is the definition of fascism. We've got about 3 minutes left on this. Folks, the book is American Nuremberg, the US officials who should stand trial for post 9/11 war crimes. The author is Rebecca Gordon. It's great to have her on. Rebecca, the most common question being asked on Twitter. And by the way, you can see what other people are tweeting, folks, by just putting Richie Allen Show, all one word, into Twitter, press enter, and you'll get a list of what everybody else has tweeted to me since the programme began. Is Dick Cheney evil? Do you believe in evil?
That is an interesting question. To be perfectly honest, none of us have access to the interiors of another human being. It is interesting to me that he had a heart transplant, and some people have said that was the first time he actually acquired a heart. What I would say is that I don't think Dick Cheney feels any remorse for what he's done, because I think he lives inside an ideology that is one of the belief that whoever is the strongest is the one who is right, that justice is merely the power of the strongest.
He's a thug then.
Yeah. And if he is evil, then so unfortunately are many people in the highest reaches of government. And it's our job as citizens of the countries or residents of the countries where we find ourselves to do everything we can to hold our own governments accountable. You're in charge of Tony Blair. I'm in charge of Dick Cheney and George Bush.
You know what, folks? Do yourself a favour. Go onto any good online bookstore and get Rebecca's book, American Nuremberg, the US officials who should stand trial for post 9/11 war crimes. Rebecca, come back anytime you want. It was terrific having you on. Great work. Thank God somebody is asking these questions. We should never allow history to move on. We should never allow the years to move on where we get further and further away from these events and these guys get away with it. I live in hope that there's a better world around the corner, and part of that is bringing these people to justice. And I think people like you are terrific and to be commended.
Thank you so much. This was a real joy.
Thanks, Rebecca. Rebecca Gordon on the line to us there from San Francisco.